Talaria, author of Across the Wire, and I'm here to do a reading of an excerpt from the novel. So I'm going to read for you the first scene in the novel from chapter 1 called Survivor Syndrome, and it's from the perspective of Mia. Keep moving. That worked most of the time. So did going to karate classes on days the dream came. The busyness helped. I went almost every evening, and tonight would be no different. I made dinner, a tuna sandwich and some nuked water in the microwave for tea. I headed to the only chair in the place, a plastic lawn chair on the balcony. I'd almost reached it when a loud crash sent me diving to the floor. The plate and mug clattered against the wood floor. Hot tea splashed the walls. My heart pounded like it was trying to escape my ribs. I covered my head, waiting for the mortar rubble to fall. The desert sand in my mouth tasted like it had so many times before, dust and grit. Someone's wail of pain made me forget my panic and focus. This wasn't Iraq. This was my apartment. The crash had come from next door. I pushed off the floor, ran into the hall, and banged on the door. "Mrs. Beatman, are you all right?" I jammed my ear against the wood, held my breath, and strained to hear. The plea was full of wobbly fear. "Help! I can't move." I turned the knob, but the door was locked. Shit! I backed away from the door. The sweet spot next to the deadbolt practically screamed, "Kick me in, for fuck's sakes." The first kick was a test. The second kick did the job. The wood door jamb splintered apart. I was through the doorway, and the apartment was an inverse of mine, except that Miss Bateman had lived there long enough to turn it into a museum. Porcelain knickknacks everywhere. The smell of mothballs and perfume was so strong I left a taste in my mouth. As I ran past the kitchen and living room, glass crunched under my trainers. Books, picture frames, and shattered glass bits were all over the floor and bed. A tall bookshelf was propped up on the edge of the bed. A burgundy slippered foot, an SOS, stuck out from the books between the triangle of the floor, bed, and bookcase. "Mrs. Beatman?" I stepped over the foot and pushed the bookcase against the wall. "Are you all right?" And it was as if the books were crawling all over. She moved, and it was as if the books were crawling over the old woman lying on the floor. "Mia?" I pulled old encyclopedia-sized books and records aside. A shard pricked my knee as I knelt down. The last few records fell away to reveal a scared old woman. Her cheek was swollen. It pulled at her wrinkled tissue paper skin, smoothing it out. I forgot my knee. "Where are you hurt?" She blinked. Her eyes darted and she winced. "My arm." I cleared away picture frames and porcelain figurines of women in long dresses. Miss Beatman was on her side. She'd landed on her arm, but didn't look broken. Footsteps sounded at the door and a man entered the room. "What happened?" Sam from down the hall arrived looking like a chihuahua trying to have a bowel movement, trembling and nervous about it all. "Get the medic," I barked. He twitched in a way no real man should. "What?" I shook my head. "Call an ambulance." He paled and ran out of the apartment as if being chased. I helped Mrs. Beatman up. "I think you scared him." She frowned, and I remembered at one point she tried to fix me up with Sam. "It's for his own good," I said. She sat on her bed and stared at the mess of her room. She seemed brittle. She had to be at least 80 years old and shaped like a pear, and she bruised like one. Her swollen face darkened by the minute. She shouldn't live alone. "Thank you, Mia," she said. "You must have heard the noise." I nodded and sat on the bed next to her. "The ambulance should be here soon." She shook her head and frowned. "I'm fine. I was trying to get one of Mr. Beatman's records. He loved Sinatra." Her chin quivered. "It's all broken. It's all gone now." It wrenched my guts sideways. I couldn't stand the sight of old people crying. There was no consoling them. They knew better than most. They'd lived long enough to know pretty words were just that. I picked up books and set them back onto the shelves, trying to help in some small way. I straightened a pewter frame with a sepia photo of Mrs. Beatman and a man in an old tuxedo. An old pain lanced through a dark place I kept shut. Placing the wedding picture on the shelf, I paused. "How long were you and Mr. Beatman married?" The corner of her mouth twitched. "Mr. Beatman and I were married for 11 years, but that was my first husband, Mr. Whalen." "First husband?" I'd never thought of my neighbor as the divorcing type. She cradled her arm and smirked. I've had 3 husbands. I continued putting books and figurines back on the shelves. The sound of broken ceramics and ambient street traffic filled the room. I've buried 3 husbands, she added. I placed another framed picture of a different wedding on a shelf. A young Miss Bateman smiled in the picture. I wondered how she had survived such sadness and how so much pain can find its way to certain people's doorsteps. I scratched at my left wrist but forced myself to stop. I understood why she lived alone now. The 2 most insignificant words I'd heard a million times came out of my mouth. I'm sorry. She nodded. Most people think it's a joke I buried 3 husbands. Her voice was hard. The glass of the picture caught a glint of sunlight. It's not, I said, and heard an ambulance off in the distance through her open window. I don't know why some think it is. Her eyes seemed unfocused. It's not easy watching the ones you love die. She was hurt. She'd lost things she'd loved, and maybe she lost confidence in her independence. I could understand those things. Maybe it's some people's way of dealing with it, I said. The siren became louder, getting closer. Mrs. Beeman stared at me. Of dealing with what? I went back to placing a bunch of old, unbroken records on the shelf. That fortune holds no favorites. That everyone dies. A fragment of a figurine stood out of the wreckage on the floor. A decorative ceramic mask smashed roughly in half. It was white with sparkles painted on the lips and a tear glittering on its cheek. It lay there with its broken side to the floor, and a wave of déjà vu hit me in the gut. The broken figurines and records became gravel. The mask became Sergeant Kosher's head. What was left of it? The sparkle became blood that caught the light. The tear was some other bodily fluid that seeped out of his remaining eye because there had been no time for tears. His brain was scattered around his head like a halo. Kosher, the patron saint of car bombs. He never saw that IED. He never knew what was coming. It made me feel better about it somehow. The worst isn't what people say, I said. What's worse? Mrs. Beeman's voice was hushed, as if we were in church. That there's nothing you could have done or will do to make their deaths worth it. Nothing that'll explain why you survived and they didn't. But in time, a small bit of understanding can come from it. The closed casket memorial service of another soldier played in my mind. Time passes and you realize you're never going to do enough to earn your right to live. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, Kosher was gone. It was the mess on Mrs. Bateman's floor at my feet again. One glance at the little old lady on the bed told me I'd said too much. Her eyes were a little wider than normal, and her lips parted. Just keep moving, I said, as I pulled books and whole tchotchkes from broken bits of crystal and porcelain clinking together. The sound punctuated her loss. Maybe it was more than just her loss in that room. Mrs. Beatman stared at me, and I wish I could have taken back those words. Wish I hadn't upset her more. I can sweep some of this up for you if you like. Her face sagged. She reached down, wincing as she did, till she pulled a salt shaker out of the rubble. The bottom was gone, but it looked like a souvenir from a tourist destination. I wondered if she wanted to glue what she could back together. It's like losing my husbands and friends all over again. I couldn't understand the mourning of possessions. They had always been dead. She wiped at her face with her hand, her knuckles swollen with age and ache. I can't believe I did this. Kneeling, I picked at the cut in my knee. My jeans were a little bloody, and the cut was already clotting. But Mrs. Bateman's regret hit me somewhere deep, somewhere raw that had never scabbed.